Picture the atmosphere inside NATO headquarters over the last few months.
Right. There's been this sort of prevailing confidence, hasn't there?
The confident whisper, exactly. The European leadership, they genuinely believed they had cracked the code.
The Trump problem.
The Trump problem. You could see it in the way people like Mark Rutte approached it. Their strategy was, well, it was built on a very specific, polite fiction.
Which was what exactly?
That if you just flatter him enough, treat him like a conventional deal maker and frame the negotiations in just the right way,
you could coax him back into the transatlantic tent.
That's it. They really believed that once he saw that Putin was the stubborn one, the one not willing to deal, he would naturally pivot and start squeezing Moscow.
But that's not what happened.
Not at all. Then the 28-point peace plan leaked.
And in an instant, that entire polite fiction just evaporated.
It did. And what's fascinating is watching the reaction to this document now. European leaders, they're treating it like it's a sudden, erratic shock.
A misunderstanding. Something that could be fixed with more talks, more diplomacy.
Right. But you have analysts like Anders Puck-Nielsen looking at the exact same document and saying something much darker.
Much more profound.
He's arguing this isn't a glitch. This ultimatum, which, let's be honest, effectively demands capitulation, this is the predictable, almost mathematical result of a European strategy that used the wrong psychological model from day one.
That's a massive analytical failure.
They thought they were playing this game of diplomatic chess with an erratic ally, but they've come to realize they were just handing leverage to a completely different kind of player all along.
Europe didn't just fail to manage the deal.
They failed to understand who is sitting across the table.
That really establishes the magnitude of the shockwave that's hitting Europe. The delusion, as you framed it, was this idea that traditional diplomatic protocols, relationship management, that it would somehow override a fundamental long-term shift in American strategic thinking.
A shift they didn't see coming or didn't want to see.
Exactly. So what we're looking at is it's far more than just an embarrassing leak. It's a necessary and I think very painful reckoning.
So for this deep dive, that's what we need to investigate.
I think we have to dig into three connected, really critical areas. First, we absolutely have to dissect that profound analytical failure you mentioned. Why did Europe keep misreading these seemingly chaotic actions?
Instead of seeing a coherent doctrine.
A doctrine aimed at U.S. disentanglement. Then second, we have to explore the moral erosion that's just baked into this leaked peace plan. I mean, the formal normalization of conquest.
Which has huge implications for international norms.
Huge. And it links directly to this broader ideological warfare that's aimed at disrupting everything. And finally, we have to outline the necessary urgent European response.
The race for resilience.
The race to build autonomous defense, industrial resilience, and societal stability. Now that bedrock assumptions of transatlantic security are fundamentally broken.
Okay, let's unpack that core misalignment first, because it feels like the foundational mistake, the one that set all of this in motion.
Yes.
The European foreign policy establishments, especially in places like Berlin and Brussels, they really just saw the former president as a chaotic personality.
Unpredictable. Someone who needed careful handling.
Right. A little flattery, maybe a very, very structured briefing book, and you could manage him. But beneath all that rhetoric, there is this deep, coherent, strategic shift.
The Trump Doctrine.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's centered on drastically reducing U.S. global entanglement.
That's precisely the disconnect. Europe was, they were analyzing the man. They should have been analyzing the doctrine.
So what is that doctrine? How is it so different?
Well, you have to think about American grand strategy since 1945. It's always maintained this really rigid hierarchy of global interests.
Okay.
For decades, it was Europe first. That was the primary theater for Cold War defense, for maintaining democracy. It was the absolute priority.
And after?
Then came the Middle East, mostly for energy security and, regional stability. And then typically last on the list was the East Asia Pacific region.
And that framework was solid. It didn't really change.
It was ironclad. It survived administration after administration. I mean, even when presidents like Obama tried to initiate that pivot to Asia, the old strategy always seemed to pull the U.S. right back into Europe and the Middle East.
And we saw that even with President Biden, right? Despite all the talk about competition with China after the invasion of Ukraine, he doubled down on Europe. It almost seemed like that old hierarchy was being restored.
It was, for a moment.
Yeah.
But the Trump Doctrine, it fundamentally reorients this. It's not a small tweak. It's a strategic update for the 21st century. And it rejects the traditional burden of collective security for allied nations.
So what's the vision? If it's not collective security, what is it?
It's twofold. First, devolve European security back to the European states themselves, force them to become sovereign defense actors.
Take responsibility.
Exactly. And second, disengage completely from the open-ended conflicts and, frankly, the political entanglements of the Middle East.
So if those traditional responsibilities are being devolved, if the U.S. is stepping back from Europe and the Middle East, where does that strategic focus shift? What's the new priority?
The focus shifts, and it shifts dramatically to regions that are seen as offering immediate strategic returns. And, just as importantly, politically potent domestic justifications.
Which means?
It means a hard pivot toward the Western Hemisphere.
Huh.
It's a return to a much more muscular, almost interventionist approach, but it's cloaked in domestic rhetoric.
So it's not framed as foreign intervention?
No, not at all. It's
Huh.
justified by linking it directly to critical domestic issues, things like law enforcement, border control, deterring narco-traffickers. This is incredibly effective politically because it turns foreign policy into a defense of the homeland.
Can you break that down a bit more? Why is framing it as border control so strategically compelling for this doctrine?
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the criticism of past interventions. They were often attacked as nation-building or wars of choice.
Things that felt very distant to the average American voter.
Exactly. The new framing elevates issues like combating transnational organized crime, securing the border, ensuring resource stability in the Americas. It raises them to the level of a primary national security concern.
So it's no longer a foreign problem, it's a domestic one.
It's an extension of border security. By defining the security challenge in, say, Central and South America in those terms, the doctrine justifies immediate unilateral action. It justifies resource allocation and a very muscular approach without needing the kind of extensive allied consensus that Europe or the Middle East always demanded.
It's a consolidation of power and focus, much closer to home.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And that really makes the failure of the European approach to Ukraine so much clearer.
It does.
Their whole belief, their hope that the former president would eventually pivot and start squeezing Moscow, it was based on a completely obsolete assumption.
The assumption that he shared their traditional transatlantic security framework.
Right, the idea that Russian aggression is the #1 threat, and it demands a unified Western response.
That assumption was, as you said, it was fatal to their strategy. You have to look at the difference in approaches. The Biden strategy was to extend the conflict.
To attrit Russian resources.
Exactly. Attrit their resources, their capacity, hope for a collapse of Putin's domestic support, or maybe his military capability. It required a long, slow squeeze.
And the Trump doctrine.
It views that approach as, well, just too costly, too risky, and frankly, failing to achieve a quick end. His objective has consistently been to pressure both Kyiv and Moscow to negotiate immediately.
To end the conflict.
To end it, not to ensure Ukrainian victory, not to enforce international justice. The priority is disentanglement and risk management for the United States.
Which means the leaked peace plan, the one demanding significant Ukrainian capitulation and the recognition of Russian conquest. That's not some outlier policy. It's not a mistake.
No, it's the most dramatic and effective way to execute the strategy of transactional disentanglement.
It's the operationalization of the doctrine.
That's exactly what it is. The transactional stance is this. The U.S. will either broker an immediate end to the war, regardless of the moral cost to Ukraine or to international law, or the U.S. will simply remove itself from the conflict entirely.
And crucially, that means refusing any commitment that risks drawing the U.S. into a direct war with Russia.
Absolutely.
Right.
He consistently frames the risk of long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, or things like NATO membership, as potentially initiating World War III. From his strategic perspective, the only acceptable outcome is an immediate ceasefire and a total separation of U.S. risk from the situation.
And this is where that polite fiction among European leaders, people like Mark Rutte, trying to frame a deal where the U.S. provides a security backstop for European forces in Ukraine, this is where it just ran into a brick wall.
A hard reality. They're trying to coax him back into his traditional role as the guarantor of European security.
Trying to get him to put American muscle behind a European commitment.
But his response was so revealing. He specifically indicated very little willingness to commit American troops or guarantees. He insisted, and this is a quote, "We're going to have Europe do that."
That's the essence of devolution right there.
It is. The U.S. is limiting its exposure and its costs for European defense, and it's forcing Europe to assume the financial and military burden that it has, for the most part, deferred for 70 years.
This brings us back to that profound risk of entrapment, which some defense analysts were warning about. They saw it as the greatest danger in Europe's continued push for these firm U.S. security guarantees.
The risk is existential for the entire alliance structure. If European leaders keep pushing for that old paradigm, demanding these strong, potentially open-ended U.S. security guarantees—
he'll see it as them not listening.
Not just not listening. The conclusion he could draw is that his allies refuse to listen, and even worse, are actively trying to entrap him into a major, costly war, a commitment that completely violates his core doctrine of disentanglement.
And if he feels entrapped or just ignored, what's the anticipated reaction? What's the worst-case scenario?
The sources suggest he could do the very things Europe is desperately trying to prevent. He could cut off all U.S. military and financial support for Ukraine, maybe even overnight.
And then make that deal.
And then swiftly finalize a dirty deal with Putin to secure his policy goal, which is simply ending the conflict. And the damage would go far beyond Ukraine. He could fulfill the doctrine by actually beginning to remove U.S. military forces and strategic assets from the entire European theater.
The argument being that if the allies won't carry their own weight, the commitment is null and void.
Exactly.
So if that traditional, almost heroic U.S. security guarantee, the commitment to actually fight for Ukraine is off the table. And let's be fair, no U.S. president ever explicitly made that commitment, and NATO allies never dared to for obvious reasons.
A direct war with Russia.
Right. So what's the viable alternative? What does Europe have to embrace now?
The viable alternative, and it's one that requires huge European coordination and investment, is what you could call the heavy armament strategy.
Okay, what does that mean?
It shifts the focus away from U.S. guarantees and onto Ukrainian capability. It rests on two main pillars. First, Ukraine has to maintain a massive, technologically advanced military after the war, trained and supplied to NATO standards by Western partners.
So they can defend themselves.
And the second pillar is that Europe and the U.S. must make a credible commitment to surge specific stockpiled weapon systems if Russia ever renews its attack.
So not a vague promise of intervention.
No, not at all. A very specific promise of precision-guided missiles, air defense batteries, long-range fires, the credible commitment to making Ukraine a porcupine too painful for Russia to even think about swallowing again. That's the practical way forward, recognizing the irreversible limits of direct U.S. intervention.
This failure to analytically characterize the doctrine, it flows directly into the moral dimension of this leaked plan. We're moving from a policy miscalculation to what feels like a fundamental threat to international law.
We are.
And that proposed recognition of conquest, that's truly historic in the worst way.
It is a decisive rupture. The leaked plan, proposing that the U.S. and other countries would recognize Crimea and the Donbass as lawfully Russian territory, even if Kyiv doesn't. I mean, that's the first time a major Western power would formally sanction the outcome of a post-1945 war of territorial conquest.
It's a massive red line.
It profoundly undermines the entire post-war international order.
Because it violates that core legal principle of state sovereignty and territorial integrity, the idea that borders cannot be changed by force.
Exactly. The foundational principle of international law since the Nuremberg trials is ex injuria, a just non-orator.
No right can come by conquest.
No right can come by conquest.
By trying to normalize this territorial grab, the Trump doctrine is aligning with a much broader, and I think more sophisticated, ideological strategy.
A moral inversion.
A moral inversion. And this strategy uses extreme disruption and these kinds of policy breaches to achieve centralized political control, often under the guise of restoring order. This ties back to that critique you mentioned in the opening, where some analysts used very strong language to describe the political actor, suggesting a failure to see the underlying psychology. How does this peace plan connect these broader strategies of moral inversion?
You can understand it through the lens of certain critical ideologies, specifically the analysis of figures like Peter Thiel. He frames the modern disruptive leader not as some traditional evil genius plotting in the dark.
But as what?
But as one who gains control by promising peace and safety.
Peace and safety.
The concept actually references a biblical theme from 1 Thessalonians, where the cry of peace and safety comes right before a catastrophic event. The political actor leverages the fear of catastrophe, whether it's nuclear war, an AI-driven collapse, or just societal chaos, to push the population toward accepting centralized control.
So the move to end the Ukraine conflict so quickly, even if it means capitulation, is selling the idea of safety, ending the existential threat of World War III in exchange for a moral and territorial capitulation.
That is the psychological mechanism at play. The fear-driven push for safety leads people to accept radical solutions. It could be one world governance to control finance, or global compute governance to control AI.
The logic being that if progress and innovation contain risks,
And risk is defined as anything that threatens safety.
then the most disruptive political actors are the ones who promise to stop the risk.
Exactly. They preach stop science or stop conflict. And this creates a situation where, in this desperate search for universal safety, society accepts a universal stagnation, or potentially a totalitarian state that's governed by fear and centralized authority.
And this moral inversion also operates at the cultural level, doesn't it? Attacking the very norms that underpin liberal democracies. You mentioned the concept of empathy.
That's the domestic front of this ideological war. Critics of this moral inversion strategy have defined a concept they call toxic empathy.
Okay, toxic empathy. What does that mean?
The concept argues that prioritizing subjective feelings and emotional validation over objective moral truth and clarity, it leads to validating lies or affirming sin in favor of what they call destructive policies.
So the core idea is that moral standards become meaningless if they have to constantly defer to the emotional needs of specific identity groups.
That's the argument.
That's a really important distinction for listeners to grasp. How does a philosophical critique like that of toxic empathy actually manifest in concrete political terms, say, in the debate over border policy?
This is a perfect example. Proponents of this moral inversion critique would argue that an excessive focus on toxic empathy directs all compassion solely toward the migrant's plight.
The immediate emotional need to cross the border, to receive aid.
Right. While in their view, ignoring the objective consequences for the common good of the host communities, they'd argue this leads to policies that ignore border law, strain public resources, and disrupt social stability.
So by framing compassion towards certain groups as morally corrosive,
they can justify highly restrictive, hierarchical policies, and they can assert that they are the ones restoring objective moral clarity and societal order.
This sounds an awful lot like the engine that's driving the anti-woke counter-revolution we're seeing across the Western world.
It is the ideological core of that movement. The anti-woke agenda is seen by its proponents as an aggressive counter-revolution, one that's aimed at eradicating diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI initiatives from all institutions.
They view DEI as a form of
tyranny, based on racial favoritism and identity politics that, in their view, undermines national unity. Their declared goal is to restore what they term colorblind equality and meritocracy.
So if we're reporting on this impartially, we have to ask, what is the functional effect of pursuing that agenda? Beyond the stated goal of restoring meritocracy, what do critics of this counter-revolution say is really happening?
According to those critics, the functional design of this counter-revolution is to systematically roll back the cultural, legal, and institutional guardrails that were established in the mid-20th century.
Particularly those aimed at mitigating historical inequalities.
Exactly. By dismantling DEI and asserting this very strict colorblind definition of merit, the practical outcome is the renormalization of hierarchy. Traditional power structures get reinforced, and the social contracts that were intended to protect vulnerable groups get dismantled.
So it's an assertion of a specific, rigid moral order in response to what they perceive as a chaotic, pluralistic, liberal society.
That's the essence of it.
And the key leverage point for these actors, it seems to be this perceived societal decay. The feeling that the world is too complex, too morally ambiguous, too decadent.
Absolutely. That perception of decay, economic stagnation, social isolation, moral ambiguity, it's the oxygen that feeds the authoritarian political impulse.
And there's a specific critique about technology's role in this.
Right. Critics observe this generalized sense of digital solitude that's driving isolation and political fragmentation. And the digital solitude isn't just, spending a lot of time online.
What is it then?
It's the mechanism where highly personalized, immediately gratifying online entertainment and digital interactions, they actually outcompete the effort and the vulnerability required for deep personal interaction.
For real community building.
And critically, for family formation.
How does that specific phenomenon, digital solitude, translate into a geopolitical vulnerability?
It's stark. That isolation is driving a massive decline in coupling and fertility rates globally. Societies that are literally failing to reproduce themselves, that lack deep community bonds, and whose citizens feel existentially isolated.
They're brittle.
They're fragile, very. When people feel this internal chaos, this loss of meaning and connection, they literally ask for strong structure and moral certainty. They start seeking out leaders who promise to set things straight with simple black and white answers.
Which fuels political authoritarianism.
A brittle, fragmented society is uniquely susceptible to that false promise of peace and safety that's offered by these disruptive, moralizing political actors.
So we've established the analytical failure, the moral threat, and these internal societal vulnerabilities. The confluence of all these factors forces us to the most immediate critical topic of all. Europe has to transition from relying on assumptions to building hard resilience.
It's no longer a choice.
This means a systemic and industrial overhaul on a scale we probably haven't seen since the Cold War.
That is correct. The imperative is defined by cold logic, and the consensus is that Russia will remain a fundamental threat to Europe's security for the foreseeable future.
And the conclusion from that is
that Europe must act independently and take responsibility for its own defense and security without relying too much on others. That is the core mandate coming from both NATO and the European Commission. The polite fiction has evaporated, and now the industrial reality has to catch up.
So what are the immediate critical actions that Europe needs to prioritize to enhance NATO's deterrence and defense capabilities against this fundamental threat?
The Atlantic Council and other defense organizations have really defined 4 essential strategic pillars that Europe has to accelerate. First, they have to dramatically increase the effectiveness of the forces they have deployed near Russian borders, not just the number of troops.
Quality over quantity.
Right. Second, they have to acquire the capability for sea control. This is a crucial area where they are currently almost entirely reliant on U.S. naval and air assets.
A huge vulnerability.
A huge one. Third, they must rapidly enhance the resilience of their critical infrastructure against hybrid warfare and cyber attacks. And fourth, and this is probably the greatest challenge, they had to overhaul their defense industrial capabilities.
Which suffer from decades of fragmentation.
Decades of fragmentation, national protectionism, and just severe underinvestment.
And NATO isn't asking for small tweaks here. The demand is for alliance members to collectively raise their military capability targets by a staggering 30%.
That's not a budget increase.
No, it's a complete structural and procurement shift.
It is a colossal demand. And the European Union, recognizing this, is trying to fix that internal fragmentation through the EU Commission. The problem is that less than 50% of defense equipment is currently procured within the EU.
And it's all uncoordinated.
Mostly national and totally uncoordinated. The industrial base is suffering from market distortion, and that's allowed non-European suppliers to gain a massive market share. The new mandate is blunt. Invest more, invest together, and invest European.
So how exactly is the EU planning to overcome decades of industrial fragmentation? How do you force member states to coordinate their defense spending?
They're accelerating the formation of what they call capability coalitions.
Okay.
This is key. Member states are now required to swiftly complete the process of forming these coalitions to collectively address critical capability shortfalls. Things like air defense, long-range precision strikes, or secure communications.
So instead of every country buying its own system,
instead of buying 10 different types of tanks or 3 different missile systems, these coalitions are meant to ensure maximum interoperability and complementarity. They require shared governance, agreed-upon budgets, and collaborative projects.
What are the concrete, measurable milestones the EU has set for this? Is there a deadline?
They are very ambitious. The EU is aiming to organize at least 40% of all defense procurement as joint procurement by the end of 2027.
That's incredibly soon.
It forces collaboration within 4 years. And furthermore, they're demanding that projects are in place to close all critical capability shortfalls by the end of 2028. This signals a necessary shift from purely national defense strategies to a pan-European industrial policy for security.
You mentioned these European readiness flagships. These are the specific high-priority projects where that coordinated investment is urgently needed. What does the European Drone Defense Initiative and Eastern Flank Watch specifically entail?
This initiative recognizes the critical threat posed by inexpensive, ubiquitous unmanned aerial systems, or UAS, and also the need to deter large-scale conventional attacks.
So it's about drones and borders.
Exactly. The flagship requires urgent, coordinated investment in counter-UAS capabilities. That means both hard kill options, like missiles and cannons, and soft kill, like electronic warfare and jamming.
And the Eastern Flank Watch part.
That demands establishing a comprehensive, multi-domain border defense capability. It means integrating surveillance, secure communication, electronic warfare assets, and precision strike systems all along the borders with Russia and Belarus. It's about creating an immediate, credible deterrent presence.
And the second flagship, the European Space Shield, that highlights how reliant modern military operations are on assets in orbit.
Precisely. Modern defense relies on intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and secure navigation. The European Space Shield prioritizes leveraging existing EU space systems, like Galileo and Copernicus, and integrating national capacities for defense purposes.
So the goal is to secure the eyes and ears of European defense.
And ensure communication resilience and secure positioning, navigation, and timing data. The launch timeline for this is set for the second quarter of 2026.
Let's talk about the artillery crisis, because that exposed the hollowness of Europe's industrial base more than anything else. Ukraine needs roughly 2 million 155mm artillery rounds every year just to sustain its defense.
And Europe's production initiatives have struggled to even meet that basic benchmark.
The crisis is systemic. It's not just about money.
It's not. Not only did Europe allow its production lines to dwindle after the Cold War, with many major defense companies focusing on boutique, high-margin projects instead of mass production, but they hit a massive bottleneck in raw materials.
Specific.
TNT and gunpowder.
Why is that shortage so systemic and hard to solve quickly?
It's a combination of factors. You've got environmental regulations, sourcing constraints, and a real loss of industrial expertise. Manufacturing explosive propellants like TNT requires specific, sometimes hazardous chemical processes.
Which are heavily regulated in Europe.
Heavily. Many of the legacy plants were simply closed down. And on top of that, sourcing key precursor chemicals, particularly the cotton linters used for nitrocellulose, which is the core of gunpowder, has become very complex because of global supply chain concentration.
So just funding new shell casings isn't enough.
It's not even close. You need the material to fill them. And reestablishing or scaling up these specialized chemical plants is a multi-year project, complicated by very strict environmental and safety standards.
So if the traditional forging methods are too slow and specialized, what are the innovative solutions being explored to speed up artillery production? You mentioned the possibility of casting rounds.
Yes. Forging the traditional method involves shaping hot metal under immense pressure. It's time-intensive and requires specialized, heavy machinery. Casting is an alternative where molten metal is just poured into molds.
That's faster.
Much faster and much more flexible as a process. While it's traditionally been considered less precise, modern casting techniques allow for more than sufficient quality for artillery shells.
So what's the key insight there?
The critical insight is that Europe has a massive existing foundry industry. Companies that cast parts for the automotive sector, construction, general engineering. Redirecting some of that capacity to cast artillery rounds, maybe even using recyclable metal, offers a viable, innovative shortcut.
It could speed up production far beyond the limits of the traditional specialized defense sector.
It leverages existing, underutilized civilian industrial muscle. It's a very smart approach.
And finally, despite this drive for autonomy, the sources all stress that Europe cannot achieve these goals in isolation.
That is the pragmatic conclusion. The short-term reality is that Europe must cooperate extensively with partners, not just in North America, but in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, India, South Korea, to rapidly fill its stockpiles and acquire complex systems.
The U.S. remains the strongest partner.
For widely used, interoperable systems like the Patriot Missile Defense Network, the U.S. is still the single strongest defense industrial partner. The solution isn't isolationism, it's industrial partnership.
And we're already seeing this happen.
We are. We're seeing concrete examples like RTX partnering with MBDA to open the first Patriot missile production facility in Germany. This kind of co-production strategy allows Europe to acquire the capability quickly, while at the same time building the long-term infrastructure for eventual self-sufficiency. And it ensures the systems are interoperable with those across the Atlantic.
We've moved from political analysis to military industrialization. Now we have to connect this crisis back to the underlying ideological battleground, specifically how technology and cultural decay affect Europe's ability to remain stable and democratic.
Because Europe's ability to defend itself militarily is, well, it's meaningless if its society is undermined from within.
The first critical front there has to be digital resilience.
Absolutely. As we discussed, critical infrastructure power grids, communication networks, is highly vulnerable to cyber attacks. And effective defense operations depend entirely on the resilience of that infrastructure.
And the biggest challenge here is bureaucracy, isn't it?
It is. Experts caution that NATO-EU collaboration on cyber resilience is a fundamental test that has to overcome bureaucratic dysfunctionality.
Meaning what?
Meaning, if critical infrastructure defense requires collective action, but it's hampered by layers of overlapping regulations, conflicting national interests, and slow decision-making, it creates a fatal weakness, a weakness that hybrid threats can exploit without ever firing a shot.
Let's turn to the AI arms race. The rush for technological dominance between the US and China is accelerating development at an incredible pace, but it's also amplifying these existential fears that moral inversion strategy can leverage.
The fear of AI leading to human obsolescence is very real. The prospect of mass job displacement and the rapid acceleration of technology creates deep societal anxiety.
And that anxiety feeds directly into the drive for centralized control.
It does. If citizens fear that AI will destroy their livelihoods or lead to some global catastrophe, they're far more willing to accept a highly regulatory, centralized, one-world totalitarian state under the guise of imposing safety and managing risk.
This fear of a superintelligence controlling all the wealth is what some analysts are calling the intelligence curse. And they claim it's fundamentally challenging representative democracy as we know it. We need to explore that claim in depth.
The intelligence curse describes a potential future where the economic and military advantages granted by a superintelligent AI are so profound that they concentrate all of the wealth and effectively all of the military power into the hands of a very small elite.
The owners and controllers of that technology.
Right. And the argument is that once this concentration of power occurs, our current political structure of representative democracy as we've known it becomes fundamentally incompatible.
How does that power shift actually undermine the democratic mandate that's supposed to flow from the people?
Well, if the superintelligence can manage global finance, logistics, and resource allocation with far greater efficiency and insight than any human government, political power will inevitably gravitate toward the entity that controls that intelligence.
This creates what the sources call a priestly caste.
A priestly caste. A small number of humans, the technical experts, who are required to interface with and understand the superintelligence. They become the only ones capable of wielding this power.
Which renders traditional democratic processes
functionally irrelevant. Elections, legislative debate, the public mandate, all of it becomes secondary. This kind of specialized control completely undermines the idea that political power originates with and is accountable to the general population.
So even if Europe achieves military security, if its citizens feel economically and politically obsolete, they become incredibly susceptible to the allure of authoritarian figures who promise to simplify the world.
That is the vulnerability. European resilience requires addressing the internal decay that makes citizens crave the rigid order promised by these moralizing disruptors. We talked about digital solitude, the mechanism by which highly curated digital entertainment outcompetes genuine human interaction, leading to mass isolation.
And this isolation doesn't just create sad citizens.
No, it erodes the basic social fabric that supports stability.
And if that isolation is driving a decline in fertility and coupling, as the sources suggest, then this societal decay becomes an existential demographic issue, not just a cultural one.
Precisely. A risk-averse, isolated, and digitally distracted society is not a resilient one. You combine the generalized stagnation, the feeling that economic progress has stalled since the 1970s, with this profound social isolation, and you create a mass population that is desperate for certainty.
When people feel chaos, when the complexities of the modern world feel overwhelming,
they are primed to accept the promises of strong authority figures. Building resilience isn't just about military hardware. It's about providing citizens with economic dignity, with grounded stability, and restoring some kind of shared purpose that can inoculate them against the seductive appeal of political nihilism and authoritarianism.
It sounds like Europe is facing not one, but two simultaneous high-stakes races. There's a race against the clock to fundamentally militarize and industrialize its defense.
And at the same time, a deeper, more profound race against ideological corrosion and the weaponization of fear.
A race to maintain the integrity of its democratic structure against forces that offer that false promise of peace and safety.
That dual challenge defines Europe's future. The miscalculation that led us to this current crisis, that failure to characterize the strategic doctrine of a major ally, was costly. But perhaps it was a necessary wake-up call.
The imperative now is action.
The imperative now is to translate this new understanding into decisive action. Europe's security is no longer guaranteed by tradition or by assumption. It is now defined solely by its capacity for self-reliance and defense, its industrial independence, and its ability to maintain a robust, cohesive society that can resist the siren song of moral inversion and centralized control. The polite fiction is over. The hard reality demands immediate and unrelenting focus on defense and industrial policy.